When we think about indoctrination, many of us imagine authoritarian regimes or propaganda machines in faraway places. But what if I told you that the Western world has been and is being indoctrinated in Zionist ideology for almost a full century? Whether in Jewish schools, summer camps, or even mainstream classrooms. These, of course, are all outside of Israel. Children are routinely socialized into a very particular worldview. This perspective centers Israel and the Zionist project as heroic, democratic, while eternally under threat. It presents the violence and wars of Israel as necessary acts of survival, and often it erases or dehumanizes Palestinians, reducing them to a shadowy, threatening other. It's vital to unpack how this process works, how children outside of Israel, whether Jewish, Christian, or non-religious, are shaped from a very young age and up to their college years to sympathize with the Zionist project. We'll examine schools, religious institutions, summer camps, youth programs, political advocacy, and cultural narratives. We'll also look at how the memory of Jewish suffering is prioritized while Palestinian suffering is denied or dismissed. And finally, how attempts at balanced teaching are increasingly silenced by accusations of antisemitism. This isn't about blaming individuals. It's about analyzing a system of ideas, narratives, and cultural reinforcement that, once in place, makes it very difficult to see Palestinians as full, equal human beings with legitimate rights and grievances. Now, it's fairly obvious that schools within Israel only provide a certain curated narrative on its existence as a nation. But you'd be surprised to know that this method of Zionist education bias of the young by a misrepresentation of both history and the plight of the Palestinian people isn't isolated within the Jewish state itself. Such bias is present amongst most Western nations, most of whom mimic the same Zionist story in response to the remnant guilt caused upon the Jewish community in the middle of the 20th century at the hands of those same Europeans. The first and perhaps most powerful site of indoctrination is formal education. In Jewish schools across the Western world, Israel is not presented simply as a foreign nation, but as the very core of Jewish life and survival. Over the past decades, many of these schools have effectively transformed themselves from being Jewish schools into Zionist schools. Religious and cultural education is consistently framed through a nationalist lens. Jewish holidays are celebrated with Israeli flags. Students recite prayers not only to God, but also for the state of Israel. And Hebrew instruction often emphasizes the modern Israeli vernacular rather than diasporic or liturgical traditions. The underlying message is unambiguous. To be Jewish in the modern age is to be Zionist, and loyalty to Israel is presented as a non-negotiable component of Jewish identity. This ideological framing also extends into how history is taught. The founding of Israel in 1948 is celebrated as the miraculous rebirth of the Jewish people after centuries of persecution and, most importantly, after the Holocaust. But as per Ilan Pappé's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, what is carefully omitted or at best distorted is the Nakba, the mass displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians in the very same year. Children are rarely taught that Israel's independence was inseparable from the destruction of Palestinian villages, forced expulsions, and the creation of one of the world's largest refugee populations. Instead, Palestinians are often presented only in the context of later wars or violent resistance, stripped of historical suffering or legitimate political claims. Mainstream Western public schools may not be as overtly Zionist, yet a similar imbalance persists. Textbooks often highlight Israel's democratic institutions, technological advances, and struggles for survival, while Palestinian narratives are marginalized. Thus, from the earliest years of schooling, whether in Jewish institutions or broader Western classrooms, students are shaped into a worldview where Israel's story is righteous and justified, while Palestinian suffering is either invisible or delegitimized. In parallel to school, Zionist identity is reinforced through prerequisite youth movements and summer camps. In North America, organizations like Habonim Dror, Bnei Akiva, Young Judea, and BBYO create immersive environments where Zionism isn't debated, it's lived. At these camps, children sing Israeli folk songs around campfires, learn Israeli dances, and raise the Israeli flag alongside their national one every morning. Educational sessions focus on Jewish unity, the centrality of Israel to Jewish life, and the heroism of the Israeli Defense Forces. These camps also serve as emotional laboratories. A sense of collective pride and belonging is cultivated by attaching Jewish survival to the Israeli state. Criticism of Israel is either absent or framed as betrayal. The Palestinian experience, again, is erased. Instead, the enemy is an abstract Arab aggressor, defined only by hostility. This emotional dimension is key. When Zionist identity is attached to friendship, love, and childhood joy, it becomes almost untouchable later in life. Questioning Israel isn't just questioning a state, it feels like questioning one's own family, one's identity, and one's happiest memories. As children become teenagers, the process intensifies through organized trips to Israel. The most famous is Birthright, Taglit in Hebrew. But many Jewish schools and synagogues also run annual Israel trips. These trips are carefully curated. Participants tour historical sites like Masada and Yad Vashem, instilling the idea of Israel as both ancient homeland and post-Holocaust refuge. They meet Israeli soldiers, young, charismatic, relatable, who are presented as defenders of freedom. Rarely are participants introduced to Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza. When Palestinian voices are included, they're often tokenized or framed through the lens of peace workshops that don't question structural inequality. This selective exposure ensures that the emotional high of discovering one's roots is tied to an uncritical view of the state. Israel becomes sacred, beyond politics. For many, this is the moment when identification with Israel solidifies as a lifelong commitment. The effect is extremely powerful. Teenagers return to their home countries convinced they have seen the truth about Israel firsthand. But in reality, they've seen a highly controlled narrative designed to build loyalty, not critical thought. For Jewish children in religious contexts, Zionism is often taught as divine destiny. Israel is presented as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, the land promised by God to Abraham and his descendants. In Avizir Ravitsky's Messianism, Zionism, and Jewish Religious Radicalism, he relays how children's prayers include calls for the protection of Israel and the IDF. Religious schools may frame modern Israeli wars as battles not only for survival, but for holiness. In more conservative movements like Orthodox Judaism, the link between faith and Zionism is explicit. Children are told that supporting Israel is a religious duty, not just a political stance. Dissenters are portrayed as traitors to both faith and peoplehood. Even in more secular Jewish contexts, holidays like Passover or Hanukkah are reinterpreted to highlight themes of liberation and survival that parallel the modern Zionist story. Religious rituals thus double as political education. The Palestinian is again absent here too. As mentioned, Palestinians are often cast as obstacles to God's will, reinforcing a worldview where empathy toward them is incompatible with religious identity. This fusion of faith and nationalism creates a powerful shield around Zionist ideology. Children, as we know, don't just learn through schools and camps. They also absorb narratives through media. As per Jonathan Sarna's 2019 book, American Judaism, A History in Jewish Households, picture books and educational videos often feature Israeli heroes, pioneers who made the desert bloom, soldiers who bravely defend tiny Israel against massive enemies, and children who dream of Jerusalem. In mainstream Western media, Israel is often portrayed as modern, innovative, and aligned with Western values. Palestinians, by contrast, are represented through the lens of conflict, as militants, rioters, or refugees, as is greatly represented in Edward Said's 1981 book covering Islam. Rarely are Palestinians shown as ordinary people with ordinary lives. Hollywood films, TV news, and even children's cartoons contribute to this subconscious coding. A child might never see a Palestinian doctor, teacher, or family on screen, but will repeatedly see images of Israeli high-tech cities, kibbutzim, or heroic Mossad agents. The result? Sympathy is unconsciously directed towards one side. Violence committed by Israel is framed as self-defense, while violence by Palestinians is framed as terrorism. children grow up with a binary worldview, one side civilized and the other irrational. And because media saturates daily life, this framing reinforces what schools and camps already instill. I really do appreciate you taking the time and watching the Kandari Chronicles. Please do join our community by subscribing so that you don't miss out on any content regarding the Arab and Muslim history, identity, and modern condition. And if you really do enjoy the channel week in and week out and would like to support us even further, please do join us at our YouTube membership program as well as on Patreon. Thanks again. One of the most consequential aspects of this indoctrination is how it shapes empathy. In Jewish education and Western culture more broadly, the Holocaust occupies a central place, and rightly so. It remains one of humanity's darkest chapters, and its lessons should never be forgotten. And thus, children learn that Jewish suffering is unique, catastrophic, and morally urgent. But here lies a painful hypocrisy, and one that Norman Finkelstein repeatedly highlights. The same children who are taught to never forget the Holocaust often grow up in an environment where Palestinian suffering is not remembered at all. The Nakba is omitted from school curricula. The images of bombed Gaza neighborhoods, the statistics of dead Palestinian children, the grinding reality of occupation, these do not enter the same moral register. This creates what scholars call selective empathy. The suffering of one people becomes sacred and defining, while the suffering of another is normalized, overlooked, or denied entirely. Children raised in this environment come to see Israeli trauma as tragic and human, but Palestinian trauma as rarely regrettable, intangibly abstract, or even deserved. The numbing of Palestinian suffering has political consequences. It allows for wars in Gaza to be framed as excusable operations, even when thousands of civilians are killed. It enables a worldview where the humanity of Palestinians simply does not matter in the same way. In this sense, indoctrination doesn't just teach children to love Israel, it trains them to discount Palestinian lives. And that is one of the wickedest intentions as well as the deepest moral failures of the system. By adolescence, many Jewish children are funneled into advocacy programs, pretty much political and civil organizations, but for the young. Organizations like Stand With Us, AIPAC's Youth Division, and Hillel International train young people to argue Israel's case on university campuses. They're given talking points, workshops, and mentorship to become effective advocates. The framing is consistent. Israel is a democracy under siege. Palestinians are either extremists or misled victims, and criticism of Israel often masks anti-Semitism. These narratives prepare youths to enter political spaces already equipped with a defensive, combative mindset. For non-Jewish students, classroom visits, pamphlets, or media campaigns funded by pro-Israeli groups also shape perceptions. The idea is to normalize sympathy for Israel as the default Western position. In this way, political activism reinforces the educational indoctrination already in place. So what's the outcome of this layered indoctrination? By the time young people reach adulthood, many see Israel's actions in the Zionist light. Palestinian resistance is rarely understood in its historical or political context. It is instead reduced to violence, hatred, or religious fanaticism. This leads to subtle but deep dehumanization. Palestinians are not seen as individuals with rights, land, and dignity, but as a faceless obstacle to Jewish safety. When violence erupts in Gaza or the West Bank, many Western-raised children who went through this system instinctively side with Israel. Not because they've analyzed the conflict, but because they've been trained since childhood to see Palestinians as the aggressors. Dehumanization also shows up in silence. When Palestinian civilians die in large numbers, their deaths don't evoke the same empathy as Israeli losses. They become statistics, collateral damage, rather than people worth mourning. This is the real success of indoctrination, not just creating love for Israel, but blunting compassion for Palestinians. In recent years, another layer has been added to this system of indoctrination: the active policing of education itself. As more schools and universities across the Western world have tried to revise their curricula to present a more factual and mutually sympathetic telling of Israeli and Palestinian history, they have increasingly found themselves under attack from powerful lobby groups. Organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, Stand With Us and lobbying networks connected to AIPAC have worked aggressively to conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, especially in educational institutions at all levels. One major tool has been the promotion of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which controversially includes certain criticisms of Israel, such as calling it a racist endeavor or comparing its policies to apartheid as examples of anti-Semitism. The effect has been chilling. Teachers who attempt to introduce the Nakba into their history lessons, or for example those who assign Palestinian literature, can be accused of spreading hate. Universities that allow student groups to host pro-Palestinian speakers face political pressure and funding threats. Even Holocaust education programs that draw analogies to contemporary Palestinian suffering have been attacked as anti-Semitic. This strategy ensures that schools remain safe spaces for Zionist narratives while discouraging any balanced approach. It effectively punishes empathy. If you teach children to see Palestinians as human beings with legitimate suffering, you risk being branded anti-Jewish. What we see here is a paradox. On one hand, children are raised to see Jewish trauma as sacred and central to world history. On the other hand, when educators try to include Palestinian trauma in that same moral framework, they're accused of bigotry. This not only silences Palestinian voices, but also erodes the credibility of genuine struggles against anti-Semitism by weaponizing the term for political ends. So how are children indoctrinated into the Zionist narrative in the West? The simplest of ways, by confusing Zionism with Judaism, by removing a faith based on human kindness, decency, and a strong set of ethics and morals, and replacing it with an ideology that has one single credo, that the ends justify the means. And now, as religious scholars, Jews from both Israel and beyond, or schools and universities tentatively try to correct the imbalance and present a more equal history, to separate the Zionist state from the Jewish faith, they face accusations of anti-Semitism, or labeled as self-hating. A return to honesty is the tip of the iceberg. What we need is a return to basic humanity, to where people feel for each other, no matter ethnicity nor religion, and hold high everyone's collective right to the pursuit of a decent life, filled with respect, integrity, and opportunity.